Good evening, everyone. This week's Parsha is Parsha Shemot. I dedicate tonight's learning in memory of my mother, Mr. Shalom, Mr. Rabinowitz, Shalom Bas Reb Yaakov Eliezer, whose first yard site will actually be this coming Thursday night. Okay, so we're going to discuss Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses. And I'm going to share with you some comments from the commentary known as the commentary of the Abarbanel. Abarbanel was a Spanish sage. He actually lived of the expulsion of Jews from Spain. He was a very great scholar and a great statesman. And I want to share with you some of his comments on this week's Parsha. And the focus is going to be on Moshe. The focus is going to be on Moshe in the early stages of his life. Now, the Torah tells us that when Moshe was an infant, his mother put him into a basket and she put him into the Nile. And Moshe was found by the daughter of Paro, Basia. He was nursed by his mother until he was weaned, when he went back and was raised in the palace of Paro, the Pharaoh. And eventually, the Torah tells us that Moshe matured, Moshe became an adult, Moshe grew up. Vayetze elachav, and he went out to his brothers, referring to the Jewish people, and he looked at their slavery, he watched their suffering, he felt their suffering, and when he was doing that, he saw that an Egyptian was beating a slave from his brothers. He killed the Egyptian and buried him in the sand. The next day, the Torah tells us, Moshe again had gone out to see his brethren, and he saw two of the slaves, the Jewish slaves, fight each other. And he rebuked one by saying, "Wicked one, why will you strike your friend?" And they respond to him, or he responds to him, "Are you going to kill me like you killed the Egyptian?" Moshe realizes that what he did is known. Out about it. He wants to kill Moshe for doing what he did. And Moshe runs away to the land of Midian. Land of Midian, the Torah tells us, he was by a well, where the 7 daughters of the Midianite priest, Yisro, the daughters had come to take care of the sheep. Other shepherds chased them away. Moshe saved them, gave their sheep to drink. After that, Moshe is invited to Yisro's house. He settles with Yisro, he marries his daughter Tzipora, and they have a son. Then the Torah tells us that when Moshe was being a shepherd, he saw the burning bush and had the vision from God telling him to go take out the Jewish people from Egypt, which is what he did eventually. Eventually he acquiesced and he went. And before he goes, the Torah tells us that an angel wanted to kill him. Commentaries explain he had just had another child, and he didn't circumcise the child. For doing that, he was going to be punished until his wife Tzipora circumcised the child herself, and then Moshe goes to Egypt. So that's a quick summary of a big part of the Parsha, but we need to know it for the next comment of the Abarbanel. So the Abarbanel discusses, how old is Moshe at this time? When Moshe went out to see how his brethren were doing, and then he saw the Egyptian, and he killed the Egyptian, and etc., going through all what we just went through. How old was Moshe during the entire time? So the Abarbanel says, without telling us why, or without explaining where he gets this from, but he understands when it says at this point that Moshe grew up and he went out to see his brethren and everything else happened after that he was about 20 years old. 20 years old. That was the level of maturity that he was at. So he was 20 years old when he killed the Egyptian, and then he ran away from Paro. Okay, the Torah tells us that where did he go? Where did he seem to go next? He seemed to go next to the land of Midian. But the Abarbanel quotes something called Divrei Hayamim Shel Moshe, the history of Moshe. He doesn't say what it is. Is it a medrash? I mean, what I'm about to say, I've heard before. I'm not sure where it comes from exactly. He calls it Divrei Hayamim Shel Moshe, the history of Moshe. And it's recorded there that when Moshe left Egypt, before he went to Midian, he stopped off and became a king in the land of Cush. We translate Cush as Ethiopia. It's definitely an African country. And he was there for 40 years. And he actually took there a Cush's wife. I recall seeing that he wouldn't touch this Cush's wife. He became the king. He had to have a queen. So he took a queen, but he never touched her. He eventually left there. And then he went to Midian. And then he married Zipporah. All right. So now let's calculate the years. Let's calculate his age. He's 20 when he's leaving Egypt. 40 years in Cush. That means he lands up in Midian at the age of 60. Then he marries Zipporah, the wife, the daughter of Yisro, which he says happened 10 years later. This could be based on what he says later on in his commentary, that when Moshe arrived in Midian, although the Torah doesn't say it, but it's not like he arrived in Midian, right away met Yisro and married Yisro's daughter. He was in Yisro for a while before he connected with Yisro. So he's saying that he's married, marries Zipporah at 70, has the first child. And then 10 years later is when he has his second child and goes to Egypt. Because we know that when Moshe arrives on the scene in Egypt, he's 80 years old. That the Torah tells us. So if he's around 70 when he marries Zipporah, so 10 years later, he goes ahead and he has a child. He's 70 with his first child. And then the next child, which we know that was born right before he went to Egypt, had to be when he was around 80. That works. Seems to work. But then he suggests that maybe we should not follow this history of Moshe, and let's just follow what the verses seem to imply. Which again, we'll start off saying that Moshe is 20 years old when he has to run away from Egypt. He right away comes to Midian. He right away marries Zipporah, and he right away has his first child. Okay, that's good. But then there's a different problem. But at the end of the day, no one can deny his second child is right before he goes to Egypt. That's the whole story that we said before when the angel wanted to kill him because he didn't circumcise his son. That's for sure when he's around 80. So that means he comes to Midian at 20, has a child at around 20, and then his next child is 60 years later. That's very odd. And number two says the Barbanel, the Torah tells us that when Moshe was leaving to go to Egypt or back to Egypt, it says, "Vayikach Moshe es ishtoi ves banav." Moshe took his wife and his sons, because now he had another baby. Vayarkivem al chamor, and he rode them on a donkey. That means they were all on one donkey, the mother and the two children. V'mhayos Gershom ish gadol. If Gershom was about 60 years old, how could all three of them go on the same donkey? Doesn't make sense. So therefore, says the Barbanel, that this story about Moshe Rabbeinu being 40 years in Cush makes a lot of sense. At the same time, though, the Torah makes no mention of it. There's no mention of it in the Torah at all. And the reason for that, he says, is because, and it's a very interesting wording that he uses, whatever Moshe did in Cush, was lost time. It's not where Hashem wanted him to be. It's not where he was supposed to be, whatever that means. It wasn't the place where he was supposed to reach the level where he was supposed to be. That all happened in Midian. In Midian is where he came to Midian. He met Yisro. Eventually, the burning bush vision took place there. So for whatever reason, he landed up in Cush for 40 years. It really was inconsequential. It was inconsequential. It had no meaning. It had no major purpose. It wasn't where Hashem was going to bestow anything unique upon him. And therefore, there's no mention of it. The only discussion is about Midian, even though it's not like Midian happened right then and there. Okay, so that's an interesting piece of information that the Abarbanel teaches us about Moshe Rabbeinu and his age throughout this period. Now, the next point of the Abarbanel, Abarbanel in his commentary usually lists a bunch of questions. It could be as many as 10, 15 questions. And then he answers all the questions with a lengthy discussion. And he brings in other points also. Now, The Barbanel asks the following question. Moshe Rabbeinu was raised in Paro's palace. And then it says Moshe grew up and he went out to his brothers to watch their suffering. Asked the Barbanel, how did Moshe know that he was a Yehudi? How did Moshe know that he was Jewish? He was a Hebrew. How do you know? Think about it. He was taken out of the water when he was a couple of months old. So good. For 2 months, for 2 years, let's say for 2 years, because his mother nursed him. He was there for 2 years, but after 2 years, he goes back to Paro's palace. He was only 2 years old when he went back. He was by his mother for 2 years. He's only 2 years old when he's going back to Paro's palace. How did he know that that those slaves were his brethren? How does he know? Why? And if he doesn't know, why would he want to go there? Says the Barbanel. And again, the pasuk does say he went to see his brethren. How did he know that he was one of them? That's a pretty strong question. It's a very obvious question to ask. 2 years old when he's only 2 years by his mother, and after being 2 years old, he goes back to Paro's palace. Where's his connection to anything of the Jewish people that he should know that he's Jewish? Now, would there be reason to say that Basia told him he was Jewish? So actually, the Barbanel before asks, how is it even that Moshe Rabbeinu could have been raised in Paro's palace? How could Basia get away with bringing a Hebrew child into the palace when this was the point of time that all the boys born to the Hebrew people, born to the Jews, referred to them, were thrown into the water to be drowned? How did she get away with it? So he explains the way his approach is that when Basia found Moshe, the only one to know about that she found this Jewish boy was her and her closest servant. The Torah says that there were other maidservants there, but they were on the shore. They were on the banks. They're on the banks making sure no one come and see her bathing. But she had her one close maidservant who, the Torah says, sent her to get the basket. So Barbanel says the only two people who really knew about this were Basia and her closest maidservant. And Basia decided she's not telling anybody what happened. And apparently this basket was small enough that she could just hide it. And then later on say, yeah, she found this abandoned child. He doesn't say that, but that's what it have to be, because where did Moshe come from? But the whole point of Basia knowing that, declaring B'al Divrim Zeh, when she opened up the basket and she saw this child, she recognized this child was from the Hebrews. But that wasn't necessarily something that anybody else had to know. And therefore, it was a secret between her and the maidservant. The secret could have been that the baby was in the water. The secret could have been at least that the baby was Jewish. But no one knew that he was Jewish. That means the Barbanel is working with the approach that Moshe Rabbeinu, Basia may have known that he was Jewish, but not that this was common knowledge. This was not the kind of knowledge that Paro would want to know, that his daughter brought this Jewish child into the palace. So it's not like everybody's walking around knowing that he's a Jewish child. Moshe is only 2 years, two of his first years of his life by his mother. Then he comes back to the palace. How does he know he's Jewish? So the Barbanel answers that even though he was being raised as Basia's daughter in Paro's palace, nonetheless, Moshe tamid davka nafshe b'yechever asher gidlasai u'b'baneha v'achrei sheniskadol yada mehem amitis inyanai. What happened here is that, she was his babysitter. She raised him for 2 years. And therefore, he would go back to her. He would visit. He would spend time. This is where it could. And interestingly, and Basia let this. She let this. Yeah, it wasn't a secret that this Jewish woman nursed him. She was a wet nurse. She nursed him. And that she raised him for 2 years, and Basia apparently let him go back to visit. But it seems like he spent a lot of time there, says the Barbanel. He spent a lot of time there. And over time, they told him who he really is. It was through not the first 2 years of his life necessarily, but over the fact that even after he went back to the palace of Basia, he was still visiting and connecting with Yocheved, his real mother, and his real family. until eventually they told him what was going on and who he really was. And once he went ahead and he found out who he really was, at that point of time, he already felt the connection and felt the pain and was concerned with the welfare of his nation. And therefore he went out to see what they were doing. And my understanding of the Abarbanel is, and Moshe left the palace. He left the palace. And when he went out to the slaves were far away from the palace. So it's not like anybody would have to know where he was going. And maybe you could say that if they knew where he was going, he wanted to see if the slaves work. But Moshe Rabbeinu really was doing it because of the fact that once he realized that he was Jewish, he went out to see what was going on. Okay. Now, the Abarbanel now makes the following comment about Moshe. Once Moshe Rabbeinu's his intellect was completed, because don't forget, when the Torah is telling us that he's going out to his brethren, when it says Vayigdal, that he grew up and he went out to his brethren, says the Abarbanel, that was 20 years old. It was really at a certain mature age that it was for somebody at that point that it really sunk in or struck Moshe who his father really is and who his mother really is and who his people really are. And once he really came to that realization, because it could very well be that it took time for him to really internalize what was going on. Here he is growing up in Paro's palace. He's really Jewish. It could have taken time for him to really internalize and come to terms with who he really was. But once he came to that, and he recognized his brethren, his heart warmed up. His heart became hot inside him. He desired to know how they were doing. And therefore he went out from the palace and he went to where they were to see their enslavement and their suffering. So that means that Moshe Rabbeinu came to a point where once he realized who he was, that he was Jewish, he right away connected and felt their pain. If you think about it, Moshe Rabbeinu, he was being raised as a prince in Paro's palace. That's where he was being raised. And he really now had to make a decision, which way is he going? Okay, I'm really Jewish, but why would I want to be with them? Look at the life I have here. But nonetheless, he made that decision. He made that decision to he felt the connection and he followed it. He didn't quash it. He didn't say, like, what am I, crazy? I have a better life this way. It's not where he went. Moshe Rabbeinu didn't allow the lifestyle that he was having in the Egyptian palace to, like I say, quash those feelings towards his people, towards his nation. Did he get help for that because of the fact that he was so close with Yocheved? It could very well be. It could very well be that connection with Yocheved and his real family helped them get there, but he still was, at a point of decision where he could have said, I can really go this way with a much better life and just forget about them. Or not that he had a chance necessarily to leave the palace, but to go and still connect and be concerned about the Jewish people. Again, he could have just said, I don't want to have anything to do with this. I don't need this. I can be a comfortable Egyptian. He didn't do that. And that really shows us the greatness within Moshe Rabbeinu, that he did not ignore those feelings towards his Jewish brethren. Now, the Torah tells us that when Moshe went out to see his brethren, he saw the Egyptian man beating the Jewish slave, and he killed the Egyptian man. So here, the Abarbanel again comments on Moshe. Gam zeh moira al shleimus tchunas adon hanaviyim. This also shows us the greatness of the makeup of the inner makeup of the master of the greatest of all prophets, umizga in his nature, v'emetz levava in the strength of his heart. Shemayasei katan ashanim, even though he was only 20 years old. Misarim mitzriyim, he's not afraid to get involved and to even get into and to even get into conflict with an Egyptian. Because he could not bear the suffering and the persecution of his brethren. And he endangered himself to kill the Egyptian in order to stand up for the honor of the Jewish people. Again, here the point is that, Moshe Rabbeinu may very well, he realizes who his people are. He wants to feel their pain and feel their suffering, but now he's going to get into a physical altercation. He's going to go kill another Mitzri. Is that far he goes? And don't forget, he's a young man. He's only 20 years old. This other person apparently, wasn't so simple for him as a young person to get involved in this kind of thing. So although he was young, like he says, he was young in years, he still could not stand the persecution of his brethren, and he endangered himself to kill the Egyptian. And we find actually that when Paro found out about it, he wanted to kill him. But that's what Paro wanted to do. But the Abarbanel is assuming that he put himself in danger to fight the Egyptian. Somebody in a Mennonite class wanted to say, well, if he was an Egyptian prince, he was probably walking around like a prince, so no one would fight back with him. I don't know. If first of all, I suggested that if Moshe Rabbeinu is still a secret by Paro what's going on, it's very possible that when he went out of the palace and he went to see them, he wasn't dressed up so fancy like a prince. It's possible, especially again. It sounds like he's doing this. They don't know he's Jewish. So why is he going out? He's going out. He's going out to see what's going on. But maybe on the contrary, it made more sense that he shouldn't look like an Egyptian prince when he went out. And maybe when he went out, he wasn't necessarily clearly an Egyptian prince. But even so, it's an interesting point that person made. Nonetheless, this is what the Bible says. He endangered himself. If an Egyptian prince wants to kill you, you're going to fight back. Especially why is he killing me when I'm beating a Jewish slave? So we can maybe approach that question from a number of angles. But this is what he says, again, to show what kind of a person Moshe was. That Moshe, again, he wasn't going to allow the suffering of his brethren at the hands of the Egyptian. Although Moshe was young and he endangered himself, that's how far he went. Now, after the Torah tells us that Moshe went to Midian, so what happened to Midian? We know he was by the well. The daughters of Yisro came. The shepherds chased them away, and he stood up for them. The Barbanel says the three stories that we have here, killing the Egyptian, getting involved in the fight of the two Jewish men, and now saving the daughters of Midian, are all happening one after the other, not because they were chronologically one after the other. There was space between them time-wise. However, let me read you his wording. Again, to point out Moshe Rabbeinu's attributes and greatness. Moshe Rabbeinu was raised in the palace of Paro. Is there a way of explaining that? Is there a way of understanding this as part of Moshe Rabbeinu becoming Moshe Rabbeinu? I mean, this entire part of the Parsha is the development of Moshe, and eventually, and this is how he develops to be the greatest prophet. And already by the burning bush, he is a great prophet. Now, and his development is happening. This is his development stages. So the Torah is trying to show us, says the Barbanel, the greatness of Moshe. He was raised at first in the palace, Asher Paro. He should learn the ways of monarchy, v'darkei anhaga, and the ways of acting in a royal and kingly way, v'darkei anhaga v'hamalchus, Asher hu mimashi ametz libai v'yigadel es ruchai shemishachloi mizeh yis libai ametz begibarim liyashrut nei kol b'habeit elamal lo yuchal l'mitzrayim go b'midyan shal yager b'reach. Moshe Rabbeinu was raised in Paro's palace to gain traits of royalty, of leadership, of courage, and of strength. So that when he needs to use, so that when he wants to, so when he sees another Jew that's suffering, he has the ability to act upon, he has the ability to go ahead and save. He's got it in him. He's got that character of leadership. He's got that character of strength, of confidence, by which if he sees someone suffering, this will strengthen his heart and strengthen his spirit, that from there now comes out that his heart is strong enough and not to back off. But anytime he sees any kind of suffering, he cannot tolerate it. He can't tolerate it in Egypt. He can't tolerate it in Midian, even where he's a stranger. He doesn't tolerate it when an Egyptian is beating a Jewish slave. He doesn't tolerate it when two Jews are fighting with each other, which maybe, again, at that point of time, he was also still very young. And number three, even he's Midian. He's a stranger. He's a fugitive. He's an outsider. No. When there's something that has to be, if somebody is being wronged, Moshe Rabbeinu will react. And Moshe Rabbeinu has that strength in him to react because of the fact that he has this royal upbringing. He has this nobility to him, that from there that's where he has the strength from to act upon what he chooses to act upon, which is to save those that are suffering. Moshe Rabbeinu is using what he was instilled with for the purposes of helping others. We learn from here that Moshe in his nature and his makeup was righteous and upright, and he had a very large and caring heart. These are the traits befitting a prophet and the traits that prepare a person to be a prophet. The Torah is telling us the traits that Moshe Rabbeinu had that were the traits that led him to be able to become a prophet. He was, in his nature, he was righteous, he was upright, he was extremely caring. Now, I would say that doesn't directly come from being a prince in Egypt. That comes because this is the kind of person he was. And by being raised in royalty, that's where he gained the strength to act upon those traits, those positive traits, those ethical traits that he had in him. And these traits, says the Abarbanel, are the traits that led to him becoming a prophet. Now, my understanding of this is that just being a caring person doesn't make you a prophet. A prophet is someone, to be able to merit prophecy, the prophet has to become someone that is very involved in self-control as a generally. He is very strongly connected with God. Clear at the same time, though, you need, as Rambam writes, when it comes to being a Navi, being a prophet, you have to have good traits. You have to have good character. If you have corrupt character, you're not going to be a prophet. A person of corrupt character is too much in themselves. A person of proper character who is so selfless as Moshe is a person who is selfless and therefore not selfish, not into himself. The person who is not into themselves, the person who is more about others and not about himself, is the person that can become worthy of becoming a prophet. Because of the fact that, again, the prophet, to be able to have that communicate with God, a person cannot be so physical. They can't be so involved in themselves. This is Moshe Rabbeinu. This is part of Moshe Rabbeinu's humility, that we know he was the most humble of all people. These traits were traits that Moshe had in him that made it possible for him to be a prophet. If you want to be a prophet, you have to be upright. You have to be righteous. You have to have good character. You have to care about others, because that's all about, number one, emulating God, And number two, it means you're not caught up in yourself. But Moshe Rabbeinu, the interesting, he says he had it in his nature, and that Moshe tzaddik v'yasher. It's part of his upmake to be righteous and to be upright. Moshe Rabbeinu was definitely born with special qualities. The question is, what was he going to do with those qualities? He had many good traits, many good qualities, but he was also growing up in the palace of Paro. That was not going to be the training ground for a good character, but it was the training ground for strength and for courage and for leadership. And with those traits that he gained in the palace and the traits that he had within him of righteousness and uprightness and caring for others, he then made the decision not to be part of Paro's palace and everything going on in there, but rather to take the traits of royalty that he learned from there and use them towards, or to use them as vehicles, as tools for his character, for his righteous character. Moshe Rabbeinu had to work on becoming who he became. If a person doesn't work on themselves, they don't grow. They can't become righteous. They can't become close to God without working. Moshe Rabbeinu wasn't just this superhuman being that God put down here on earth. That's not how a prophet becomes a prophet. Moshe Rabbeinu wouldn't be considered such a great person if it was just naturally all this. Moshe Rabbeinu, like I said, he clearly was born with certain great qualities. And he was clearly given different tools, some great, very good tools to work with by being grown up in royalty. But the question is, what was he going to do? And as Barbanel said before, he spent a lot of time with Yocheved. He had good influences, but he was still a prince of Egypt. And he still had to make that decision of which direction he was going to go. And the direction that Moshe chose was a direction that said that I'm going to use what I learned in Paro's palace to help others, to serve others. And because of that, he merited that. Those were the traits that were prerequisites for him then to build further to become the greatest prophet of the Jewish people. It's also important to point out that Moshe Rabbeinu is doing this now again. He's not in a certain way, he's not doing it on his own because he had an influence from Yocheved. But he clearly had he clearly was growing up in the palace. And that was a place of very strong influence that he shouldn't go in the direction that he did. And it was up to him to decide which direction he was going to go. And he made that decision under some very trying circumstances. And that's a very important lesson for us. The greatest leader the Jewish people ever had, the greatest prophet that ever lived, who brought down the Torah and gave the Torah to the Jewish people and brought the Torah into the world, Moshe Rabbeinu. How did he become Moshe Rabbeinu? He didn't have it like Yaakov, who learned by his grandfather, Rabbi Yitzchak. Even Yosef, that left his family at 17 years old. 17 years he studied with his father. In some ways, he's very much like Abraham, who was on his own. Moshe Rabbeinu teaches us that you can attain greatness. You can attain greatness even if you're on your own. And it teaches us, again, we can't necessarily expect to be like Moshe Rabbeinu, but it means that all of us have to learn from Moshe Rabbeinu that even when we're on our own, we need, should, and can be servants of Hashem, even when we're not in an environment that helps us. We're on our own. We can still do it. How much we can do, at what level we can do, that cannot be quantified necessarily. At the same time, it doesn't mean that under those circumstances we're all on your own, that you're done. There's nothing you can do. You can't fight all the influences on your own. It's possible There's a level that we can do it. Again, I'm not trying to say that I can't judge every single situation a person finds themselves in. But it is a lesson that has to tell us. The lesson tells us here that even if you're on your own, you need, should, and can be a servant of Hashem. That's what Moshe was. And Moshe did it. The greatest leader of the Jewish people, the greatest symbol of greatness that we have, Moshe Rabbeinu, didn't have a regular upbringing, didn't have a regular situation to grow in, but he did it. And it's a lesson for us that we can be servants of Hashem under all circumstances, even when we're on our own. Have a wonderful evening.